What's up guys, with the release of the Forsaken Masters yesterday, a lot of builds aren't working anymore. I've been trying to update my Fireball Witch Carpet Bomber to make it work with the Forsaken Masters mini expansion, and I am happy to say that it has been a success. The build is actually stronger than it was before. I hope you guys enjoy it. If you have any questions, ask me here in the comments or ask me on the forum. Thank you for watching. What's up guys, LiftingNerdBro here. Welcome to the Fireball Carpet Bomber build guide. This build is updated for the Forsaken Masters expansion, and not only does it work, it is now even stronger than it was before. With this patch we now have more damage, more mana regen to sustain our Arctic armor, less cost for our spells, and easier access to life. So it's all good. I love this patch for this specific build. Okay, so first of all, what is this build and who is it suited for? This build is well suited for beginners or new players to Path of Exile who seeks an effective, safe and fairly simple but fun character to begin their adventures in Bray class. Additionally, this build is viable for both softcore and hardcore gameplay and requires no specific uniques or other costly items. It fits players who seek a powerful build that can reach endgame to easily farm piety and maps to start amassing wealth. I have tested this build up and until level 74 maps, and so far these maps haven't been a problem, and the clear speed is good. The great thing about this build is that all of this can be achieved for less than 15 to 20 chaos orbs, and that is very cheap for a build that is able to do these kind of maps. And if you decide to invest some more currency, this build should easily make you able to farm the highest level maps and their bosses. This build was actually originally designed for the 1 month hardcore race in patch 1.1.5. And this was going to be my first character in that league, and that of course meant that I had no currency to invest into this build when I started out. Therefore I wanted to create a build that was both cheap but still very effective, that would allow me to farm piety and dominance for items, as well as to take me to endgame maps. This goal was achieved, and this character ended up being very safe and tanky, and it had some great damage output. I was very happy with the outcome compared to the price cost of this character. So let's get a little more specific. The strength of the build lies in having a good amount of damage and having a shit ton of mana regeneration. At my current level I have about 286 mana regeneration per second. The combination of Eldritch Battery plus Discipline and Clarity allows us to run a level 22 plus Arctic armor, which significantly reduces the amount of physical and fire damage that we get hit by. That, along with having capped resistances and a big life pool, is how we are able to achieve such a strong defense for this character. We have no evasion and only little armor to begin with, as in the beginning and middle of the game you will want to stack energy shield on your gear for it to be converted to mana through Eldritch Battery. Later on in the game, when we have enough mana and mana regen to sustain Arctic armor through both our skill tree and abilities, you should start using some hybrid armor and energy shield gear to further bolster your defenses. For anyone who doesn't understand how Arctic armor works, let me give you a little rundown, as this is important for this build to work. Arctic armor reduces a flat amount of physical and fire damage when activated, but it also drains our mana and even more when moving. For that reason, the most important thing to make Arctic armor work at higher levels is to have sufficient mana regeneration to be able to sustain it. Arctic armor is very efficient at reducing both physical and fire damage, and just like regular armor, it is very strong against small frequent hits such as attacks from monkeys, sea witches and even the dreaded titty bitches in the Lunaris temple. I should note that if you experience taking too much damage from these mobs, then it is simply because you need to further level up your Arctic armor. Arctic armor really starts to shine around level 13 and 15. Before that, it seems a little weak, but you'll have to see that for yourself. It does, however, have one weakness. It is not very strong against the slow, really heavy-hitting monsters, as this flat damage reduction that it provides simply isn't enough. We do, however, have a method of keeping us safe from that as well, but I will get into that later on in the video. And as you can see in this picture, a level 20 Arctic armor requires at the minimum 230 mana regenerated per second to be able to sustain this skill. Throughout this build guide I will explain how we, with the use of certain auras, skill nodes and gear affixes, are able to achieve this. Reflect damage is absolutely no problem with this build. The reason for that is that All of our damage comes from fire, and since we're running Arctic Armor and the Purity of Fire aura, which both gives us a lot of additional fire resistance and a flat reduction of incoming fire damage, we hardly feel any reflected damage. You can easily do elemental reflect maps on this character as long as your Arctic Armor is leveled high enough and you have your Purity of Fire aura activated. For damage, we are, as some of you probably already have guessed, using Fireball. And for you new players, let me just quickly explain how the Fireball mechanic works. Fireball deals damage in two ways: when the projectile hits, and then additionally when the projectile explodes. The projectile alone will not do any area of effect or AoE damage, but the explosion will, and because of that we're therefore able to hit more than one enemy at a time. The best way to make Fireball deal lots of damage for our specific build is to focus on making that explosion damage as high as possible. I should note that you can't really trust the tooltip for Fireball. The tooltip only shows you the projectile damage, and since we're focusing on the explosion damage and using both the skill gems and skill nodes to further boost the damage of the explosion damage, the output of our Fireball is a lot higher than what the tooltip states, so just ignore the tooltip. You can't trust that. For damage you'll be using a Fireball linked with greater multiple projectiles, concentrated effect, fire penetration and spell echo. Concentrated effect will greatly increase the explosion damage. Fire penetration will, to put it simply, increase your overall damage by reducing the resistances of the monsters, and spell echo will greatly increase your casting speed. Greater multiple projectiles will allow you to shoot out additional Fireball projectiles that all has their own projectile and explosion damage. When multiple of these explosions goes off, we end up dealing a lot more damage, which easily makes up for the reduction of projectile damage that greater multiple projectile is responsible for. If you don't have the mana to sustain a greater multiple projectile skill gem, I recommend using a lesser multiple projectiles skill gem until you do. An additional awesome bonus of using either lesser multiple or greater multiple projectiles is that if you position yourself correctly, you'll be able to shotgun the enemy. This basically means that you're able to hit the same target with more than just one projectile and explosion at a time. By holding shift and placing the cursor further behind your target, the fireballs will, as demonstrated here, fly out in a smaller cone, and thus making you able to hit the same target with more than one fireball at a time. This is great for boss farming and single target damage, and for instance hitting Piety with 6 fireballs multiple times will bring her down pretty fast. If you only have a 4-linked armor, you can leave out the fire penetration skill gem. I do, however, highly recommend getting yourself a cheap 5-linked energy shield armor. I got mine for 6 chaos orbs, so it can be obtained fairly cheap, and with the new changes to crafting, it should not be too hard to obtain, and it makes a huge difference in damage output having that fire penetration skill gem as well. For curses, you'll be using flammability linked with increased area of effect. Flammability basically works by reducing the resistances of the mobs you are attacking and further increasing the radius of your AoE damage explosion from your fireballs. For defense, we're using Arctic Armor, and Arctic Armor doesn't really have any specific skill gems that it needs to be linked with. The only really powerful thing it can be linked with is Empower. So if you can obtain that, that's good. If not, it really isn't that important. Not until late game, that is. For additional defense, we're also incorporating a cast when damage taken setup. For this specific build, we're using cast when damage taken, Enduring Cry, Increased Duration, and Immortal Call. This cast when damage taken setup is there to help us out in specific situations where our Arctic Armor and armor simply isn't sufficient in reducing the incoming physical damage. As mentioned earlier, Arctic Armor is a powerful and very strong defensive skill, but its main weakness is those really heavy hitting mobs and bosses such as the Colossal Bone Stalkers, for instance, and a boss like Brutus. If being hit by these attacks, this cast when damage taken setup will then proc Immortal Call, which will make us immune to physical damage for a few seconds and then allows us to move away to safer grounds. Since we only want our cast when damage taken setup to proc when taking those big spikes of damage, I recommend leveling your cast when damage taken skill gem to level 9, Enduring Cry to level 10, Immortal Call to level 9, and since Increased Duration is a support skill gem, it can be leveled to level 20. For this build we're running 3 auras. These are Purity of Fire, Clarity and Discipline. All of these auras should be linked to reduced mana. Purity of Fire, as mentioned earlier, is important for this setup, as it will not only make us take less fire damage from enemies, it will also greatly help us against reflected elemental damage. And as an additional bonus, it will make the gearing process cheaper, as you won't need as much fire resistance on gear as you will get that through the aura. Clarity and Discipline are 2 of the main components that allows us to run Arctic Armor at high levels. Clarity is fairly simple to understand, it simply gives us a flat increase in mana regeneration. Discipline is a little more complicated. To understand how this works to give us more mana regeneration, I need to explain how Eldritch Battery works. Eldritch Battery is a keynote fairly close to the Witch starting area in the skill tree. It works by converting all your existing energy shield to mana. Your mana regeneration rate percentage is based on your total maximum number of your mana pool, and that of course means that the higher your total mana pool is, the more mana you're going to regenerate per second. The Discipline aura works by adding a flat amount of energy shield, and with Eldritch Battery, this energy shield is converted to and added to our total mana pool. To put it simple, the Discipline aura will, in combination with Eldritch Battery, increase our total mana pool and, as a byproduct, increase our mana regeneration rate, and thus leaving us able to run Arctic Armor on a higher level. And this makes a significant difference. For extra mobility, we're incorporating Lightning Warp linked with reduced duration and faster casting. And remember that Arctic Armor drains mana faster when moving or running. If you use Lightning Warp to move around, that is not going to happen. It will only drain your mana as if you were standing still. The last skill gem setup is optional, but I highly recommend it, as it will increase your survivability and clearing speed a lot when you learn to use this properly. The setup is a spell totem linked with Summon Skeletons, faster casting and blind. Casting this totem before engaging a mob pack will result in the enemy mobs attacking the skeletons instead of you, which leaves you free to cast your fireballs from a safe distance. It basically creates decoys for you. This setup is also great for fighting the less mobile bosses such as Brutus, as the skeletons will swarm him and blind him. This of course makes it a lot safer and results in you being able to position yourself and therefore killing stuff faster. So how do you level this character? Well, if you want, you can use Fireball straight from the beginning. However, until Fireball gets linked with either lesser multiple or greater multiple projectiles, it isn't too effective. For this build, since it has so much casting speed and spell damage, I personally recommend using Ice Nova linked with added lightning damage for the first 24 levels. When reaching level 24, pick up a Searing Bond totem and link your Fireball with lesser multiple projectiles. Lesser multiple projectiles can be obtained by completing the Sharp and Cruel quest on normal difficulty in Act 2. From there on, simply keep using your Fireball and Searing Bond totem. At some point it will be a lot more efficient for you to cast additional Fireballs instead of placing your Searing Bond totem. When that happens, simply stop using Searing Bond. And I should mention that when leveling, you are going to experience a big improvement when adding in Concentrated Effect and Spell Echo, so try to get these as early on as possible. And now for the big thing, the skill tree. And remember, the 3 main things we're looking for in our skill tree is life to be able to stay alive obviously, mana regeneration rate to sustain our Arctic Armor, and fire, spell or elemental damage to kill stuff. Getting skill nodes that further increases area of effect damage and radius synergizes very well with this build as well. To further boost our mana regeneration rate, we are moving towards and picking up these aura clusters, Sovereignty over here, and to the left we're also picking up Influence. When reaching really late game, you can pick up these skill nodes. Inner Force is really strong, and all of these 3 skill nodes and also Athleticism will increase the power of Arctic Armor. You should however be aware of that it will also increase the amount of mana drained, and this will not show up in the tooltip. Remember that if you can't figure out why your mana is being drained faster than you're able to regenerate it, even though the tooltip says you have enough mana regen, then it is probably because of these buffs and skill nodes. So The way I leveled this character was to start by picking up the energy shield and mana regeneration node here in the beginning of the witch tree. I then picked up spell damage, faster casting, and then elemental dominion. Faster casting is really nice in the beginning of this build, and the gameplay is going to feel a lot nicer with these. I then picked up Firewalker and continued through this fire and elemental damage skill nodes. From there I moved towards Blast Radius and down into Deep Wisdom. Blast Radius and increased area of effect is great for our purpose, since the damage we mostly rely on comes from the secondary attack of Fireball, the explosion damage. From there on I continued up and through to Heart and Soul and picked the last Mana Life hybrid skill node. At this point in time I started to move towards Cruel Preparation and Deep Thoughts like this. At this early on, it really isn't necessary to pick up the fire damage nodes. You can do if you want to, but I instead went back and moved towards the agility skill nodes that will grant us 30 dexterity. In this build we're going to require some amount of dexterity to be able to run Arctic Armor and greater multiple projectiles, and those 30 dexterity makes it a lot easier for us to gear up without making too many compromises. But you should of course spec out of this skill node later on if you get enough dexterity on your gear. From here on we start to move towards the Templar area. In this area we will start by picking up Celestial Walker and then move towards Prestigation. I can't pronounce that, you know what I mean. And we're getting that for that nice cast speed and mana regeneration rate. We're then moving towards Amplify for a nice boost to our AoE capabilities, and after that we're going to tour the Templar life area by first moving towards and picking up Discipline and Training. When we have that we're going to pick up the other life nodes. And I actually recommend picking up the 1% life regeneration node here until we pick up Shaper later on. When we have that skill node you can then use a respec point and remove that skill node if you want to. Before leaving this area we will pick up these 3 elemental damage skill nodes and the 40% increased mana regeneration skill node. After that I then picked up these 4 Chaos Resistance Life hybrid nodes. Purity of Flesh is well worth the other 3 skill points for our build, especially since we also want to get access to these aura skill nodes at some point in time. And we're now at a point in our build where it is time for you to decide whether you want to start moving towards using Eldritch Battery and convert your energy shield to mana, or if you want to pick up some more life first. Personally, at this time I started to feel a little squishy as I didn't have enough mana regen to sustain an effective leveled Arctic Armor. And to make that work, I needed to pick up Eldritch Battery and the Aura skill nodes. So instead of picking up more life, I went back to the Templar area and picked up these Aura skill nodes and then continued from the Witch area towards Eldritch Battery. Depending on how effective your mana regeneration is at this point in time, you have to decide whether or not you should pick up Eldritch Battery now or wait. If you decide to go for Eldritch Battery, you will of course no longer have the additional energy shield to use as a defense. So you need to make sure that the additional energy shield you gain from switching to Eldritch Battery is going to award enough mana regeneration rate to run a decent level Arctic Armor to make up for that. Otherwise you will just make yourself weaker. Luckily it only takes 1 respec point to remove Eldritch Battery if you figure out you need more energy shield and mana regen before making the change to making it work. I personally picked up Eldritch Battery, and that along with my Clarity and Discipline Aura made it possible for me to sustain a level 14 Arctic Armor at that time, which was a huge boost to my survivability at that level. At this point in time I was around level 55, and at this time you really need to get yourself some damage mitigation, and you may have to invest in some gear to give you enough mana regeneration to sustain at least a level 12 or 13 Arctic Armor. The higher level you're able to sustain, the better of course. If you haven't already by this time, I highly recommend picking up the 3 Flask Effect skill nodes. These makes a huge difference as they will greatly influence the amount of life that we're getting from our flasks. But just as important, they will also greatly increase the amount of armor that we receive from our Granite Flask. From this point on, it is time to move towards Shaper. But on the way we're first going to pick up Quick Recovery and the 2 partner skill nodes. These are great for our purpose. When you have those, go ahead and pick up Shaper. When you have picked up Shaper, you can now spec out of the life regeneration node that we picked up earlier. It is now time to get some more total life. So let's move towards the Cyan life wheel, where we're going to pick up 2 life nodes, including one of the most badass life skill node, Constitution. And now again you have to decide whether you want more damage, more mana regen and aura effect, or more life. To get more life you can simply pick up all of these life nodes in this cluster. This is very efficient and will make a big difference in your total life pool. To get more effect of your auras, you should consider picking up Influence and the 2 other aura skill nodes here. Remember that every time you're increasing the effect of your auras, you're gaining more mana regeneration rate, especially at those higher levels. However, if you instead want some more damage, there's no better way to obtain that than by going to the top of the skill tree and picking up these fire damage skill nodes. The last points I recommend spending on Athleticism and the 2 other life nodes, along with Inner Force, to get more life and some awesome additional power to your Arctic armor to make you a lot more tanky as well. And lastly, getting those 4 elemental damage skill nodes to further increase your damage. And that's it for the skill tree, guys. And don't worry, I will link to both the finished skill tree and 2 leveling skill trees. Now the last thing we're going to talk about is what kind of affixes and stats you should aim for on your gear for your character. And let's quickly summarize what this build needs to function and prosper. Well, we need life and resistances so that we don't die. We also need enough mana regeneration to sustain a high level Arctic armor, and we also need fire, elemental and spell damage to increase the damage of a fireball to kill stuff. And let me just mention, when reaching Merciless, there is no longer an excuse for not being resistance capped. If you're not by this time, go fix it. When you are resistance capped, this is the stats in priority you should aim for when changing gear. For defensive stats, we want life as the main priority. Secondly, we want energy shield and armor. Thirdly, we want mana regeneration. And lastly, we want intelligence, mana and chaos resistance. Until you're able to sustain a high-leveled Arctic armor, energy shield is more important than armor, as that energy shield along with Eldritch Battery will boost your total mana to increase your mana regeneration. But as soon as you have enough energy shield to sustain a level 22 plus Arctic armor, then you should of course try to get some armor energy shield hybrid gear for even more defense. For offensive stats, we want fire damage and elemental damage as our first priority. Secondly, we want spell damage, and the reason spell damage isn't among the first priority is that spell damage does not add to the burning damage that we sometimes will get with this build. Thirdly, we want cast speed, and lastly we want critical hit chance and critical hit multiplier as the least important offensive stats. And lastly, I can't stress this enough, listen up guys. It is very important for us to use a Granite Flask. A Granite Flask along with the Flask Effect skill nodes are going to provide you with a ton of armor. And this should not be underestimated. It will make a huge difference in your survivability. If you want to invest some more currency into this build, I will in my forum post link to a few uniques and specific items that goes really well with this build. It is however not something we're going to discuss in this video. Oh, and lastly, for the Bandit quest rewards, you should Hellbow on normal for the additional 40 life, and then kill them all on Cruel and Merciless to get that additional 2 skill points. And that's actually it guys. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them below in the comments or by going to my forum post on the Path of Exile forums. I will make sure to answer any questions that haven't already been answered in this video. Thank you for watching, and bros, do you even nerd?